afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tseli Khiba. As you can see, there's an LI at the end, and that's basically because in my home language, Sesotho, we're really efficient with letters, so we did away with the D and stuck with the LI. So just to clear that out. So I am from Maseru, Lesotho, which is the capital city. And I have completed most of my tertiary education here in Cape Town, where I did my law degree and my master's in law, specializing in commercial law. I had a brief stint in Hamburg, Germany, where I did an exchange program where I looked and focused more on international business and comparative law. I first became involved in the cannabis industry in 2016, where a client basically approached our law firm to assist them to obtain an operator's license, as it's called in Lesotho. Now, operator's license is basically, they enabled the holder of the license to basically do everything involved in the whole cannabis processing. It allows them to cultivate, manufacture, trade, and export the product. And that's how I got involved in the industry, and I've had a keen interest since. So this afternoon, I'll be presenting on a topic that I've been doing a bit of research on, and that is the harmonization of medicinal cannabis law in the SADC region. And basically, my intention is to develop a model template that could be taken up by policymakers within the region, and this would probably accelerate the level at which laws are being developed, which I think everybody here would be very keen for. During my presentation, I will cover the relationship that people in the region have had with this plant, and that basically highlights that the successful implementation of any policy needs to be contextualized to ensure that it is successful. Thank you. And I will also try to highlight how practical the solution could be. Sorry. Hello? Okay. So I will try to emphasize how practical the solution would be for the region and encourage policymakers to take it up. I will also be discussing the various reform efforts taking place across the region and the policy considerations, as well as discussing the benefits of adopting a harmonized approach and why a model law would be the most appropriate mechanism to do so. So, firstly, I would just highlight what has basically been happening in the cannabis industry in the SADC region. I would start with Lesotho, my home country, where cannabis has been recognized for a long time by the indigenous people of Lesotho, as it has many uses, both health-related as well as recreational. So in Lesotho, the cannabis has been used as a key source of hard currency, and it provides much-needed income for many of the families. However, despite its close ties to the people of Lesotho, growing cannabis on a small scale still remains a criminal offense. I will get to discussing the Drugs of Abuse Act of 2008, which then permitted Lesotho to issue licenses a bit later in the presentation. Next, we have South Africa, which is our beautiful host country for the first CannaTech conference. South Africa also has a long history with the cannabis plant. Specifically during the pre-colonial era, a lot of the indigenous people used it for similar reasons, that being medicinal use, and at the time it was typically associated with traditional African populations as well as groups of lower economic status. And then we have Zimbabwe, where cannabis has also been used widely and known for having healing properties, but it has also uniquely been known for uplifting spirits and opening doors to the spiritual realm, and has been used in a number of practices, and also for cosmetic uses as well. So basically what I was trying to highlight is that, in short, people within the SADC region have had a long relationship with cannabis, and that all was pretty much fine for a long time until this happened. So at an international law level, in the 1960s, it started with the single convention, which was an attempt to consolidate a lot of the prior conventions that had been signed and treaties that basically controlled the use and the distribution of drugs, to put it simply. So basically, the single convention tightened controls on the production, use, and distribution of illicit narcotics and broadened their scope to include cannabis and other drugs which may have a similar effect. The 1971 convention included a number of synthetic substances, such as LSD, barbiturates, and hallucinogens, and the 1988 convention was intended to complement the other two conventions by addressing the illicit trafficking of drugs. So many countries, excluding the ones listed, are signatories to the treaties. And the treaties are not self-executing. Therefore, it was a requirement that the signatories would need to ratify and domesticate the terms of the treaties within their own domestic law. And that is a process that soon took place. At a SADC level, in 1996 and in 1998, respectively, the region already took up the international legal framework to indicate the intention to combat the illicit trafficking of drugs, but also to assess and harmonize the health regulatory framework in the region. Since the 1960s, when the international treaties were concluded, there were varying extents of self-defection from the prohibitions against the illicit drug framework. And there were various reasons for this. For example, it became evident that there was a clear divide on drug control approaches. On one side of the divide, more countries opted for pragmatic evidence based on harm and reduction of policies, while others still clung to the zero tolerance approach, although it had failed to produce any significant changes or success. In the 1980s, the discovery of the cannabinoid receptor system revolutionized scientific understanding of cannabis and its effects and uses. And in the Netherlands, in the 90s, we had the introduction of the coffee shops, which basically allowed cannabis to be sold for personal consumption. So bringing it closer to home, within the African region, we've seen more trends in the recent years with African countries, specifically within the SADC region, taking up policies to reform their laws to accommodate mainly the medicinal cannabis industry. And the above diagram basically shows where we are. Basically, recreational is still largely banned, but the green illustrates that the countries have, to some extent, reformed their laws dealing with medicinal cannabis. And the orange, there are also a bit of the gray areas where there has been talk about draft legislation being created, although it has not been made available. But also there are varying views across the region regarding cannabis, where, for example, you'll see Lesotho and South Africa being more active in the industry, so is Swaziland. But in other SADC countries, such as Botswana, they have chosen to adhere to a stricter approach to regulating the industry by basically keeping it illegal and inaccessible. And that is also due to a number of reasons that have been highlighted during this conference, specifically the association of cannabis and mental health and the psychoactive effects of the plant. So, back to Lesotho. So in 2017, Lesotho issued its first cannabis license. However, Basotho have had a close relationship with the plant since before independence in the 1960s. And this phrase became popular at the time because, to basically translate, it means we would like our land back and our cannabis too. So I think this really highlights how closely guarded we've held our cannabis. And this is why in 2017, Lesotho became the first African country to issue a license in terms of the Drugs of Abuse Act of 2008, which repealed the Dangerous Medicines Act of 1973 to ensure the availability of certain drugs and medicines. Now, the Drugs of Abuse Act ensures that this process of licensing is carried out under the Ministry of Health. And at the moment, the government is in the process of establishing a narcotics bureau, which would basically be responsible for the issuing and assessment of license applications. And then we have South Africa, which in 2018, the Constitutional Court made a pronouncement relating to the private use of cannabis, and it basically allowed for adults to use it for personal use in the private dwelling. However, the quantity of cannabis that an individual can grow in private has not been specified yet, nor has the definition of private been clarified. So it's still a bit of a gray area, and due to the principle of the separation of powers, the Constitutional Court has allowed Parliament 2 years to basically enact a law that would capture what that judgment was intended to do for the industry. So we have until 2020 to see how the South African Parliament will embody that. And I believe there is a draft bill in place, and it's still in progress. So across the region, there are other member states as well at varying levels of development. Both in Malawi and in Swaziland, there have also been some commercial activities taking place. And with all these developments taking place, I believe it is a key time for policy makers to make decisions and to determine how they intend to regulate the market and how they intend to approach the industry. There are various ways that this can be done, from decriminalization, legalization, and I think it is also important for policymakers to also appreciate that it's not a binary decision. It doesn't have to be full legalization or complete prohibition. There are varying intermediate states in which they can choose to regulate their market. But I think the first step is definitely to make a decision and make a policy decision in the right direction. As part of my research, I would like to propose, and I think this is the most sensible option, I would be proposing that the policymakers look into developing a harmonized approach to the cannabis industry for the region. And the benefits of developing such a model would be the ease of business and access to market. It would assist with trade facilitation, which I'll expand a bit on a bit later. And it would also reduce the development issues relating to the development of drugs and the different scheduling and accessibility issues. And it would encourage coordination of research projects and medicinal cannabis across the member states. And ideally, with the harmonized approach, that would also solve a lot of the cross-border issues that are evident, whether it's as a personal individual trying to carry my medicinal cannabis products across borders, but then also on a commercial level, with a lot of companies that have supply chains that transgress borders, a harmonized approach would be extremely beneficial. So I would be proposing the use of a model law as the appropriate vehicle for the modernization of a unification process of the national laws, because the model law, it's a flexible tool, it's soft law, therefore it is optional and it is not binding. The individual countries would be permitted to choose provisions that can be incorporated into their own national laws according to their specific context. But ideally, the way the provisions would be structured would still be in a harmonized way, which would improve the consistency and standardization of the legislation across the region. It would provide a convenient source of law. It would also be easily accessible, and it may also be a model that could perhaps be replicated more broadly across the region. So here are some of the points that I had stated that also illustrate the benefits of the template. With that, in terms of structure, it would guide according to industry norms and present a range of potential options. And it would also include explanatory commentary where necessary, so that policymakers would be guided and would understand some of the theories and best practices that are to be incorporated into their legal system. And this would obviously aid efficiency and consistency and reduce transaction costs and time. So here I would just like to highlight some of the potential provisions that would be going into such a model law template. One, it would be which government agency would regulate the industry. So as I've indicated a bit earlier, in Lesotho at the moment, it's the Ministry of Health, and in South Africa, it's SAPRA. However, as an alternative, maybe countries could also look at having a multi-sectorial group that would be representatives from the health department, agriculture, tax department, environment and trade, seeing as how the various aspects of the cannabis plant impact on the different industries. Therefore, they could give a more holistic overview in assessing license applications and the direction in which they wish to take the industry. Secondly, the model law could provide for a provision that indicates how expansive or accessible will participation in the market be. And I feel that this speaks to a lot of the issues that are taking place across the region relating to what is perceived to be an influx of a lot of international investment and commercial practices coming into the cannabis industry at the expense of perhaps the indigenous people that have been involved in the industry, looking into the black market as well and how it can be incorporated and brought into the mainstream. So the legislation should ideally also address that. It could look into either having a larger market with many producers that are allowed to grow cannabis, but obviously that would have practical implications as well for the regulator in terms of how to oversee and manage such a large-scale industry. Or alternatively, they can choose to keep it limited, but then again, that creates the risk of having a parallel underground illicit market, which would also be undesirable. Number three, there would be a question about how much the appropriate license cost would be. Many governments are tempted to legalize and regulate cannabis based on the amount of revenue that can be generated in the form of license fees. However, high license fees also exclude potential stakeholders who are eager to partake in the industry. So these are the kind of considerations that need to be looked at. Because, for example, in my home country at the moment, the price of a license still goes for about 500,000 rands, which does exclude a lot of the local participants that would like to be involved in the industry. Number four, another provision to look at would be who can own a cannabis business. And that would speak to whether it can be foreign-owned or local participation or a combination of both. Again, just giving an example of Lesotho, where our Land Act does not allow for foreign entities to own land. So people have gotten into a number of agreements to basically loopholes to get around that. Which needs to probably be better regulated. Then you would also look at the medicinal industry as well, which, as we've discussed, it is highly technical and capital intensive. So there might be some nuances there that in itself restrict the number of participants in that specific area. And then we would also look at the illicit market concerns. And that is, again, trying to prevent this parallel industry from basically continuing to grow. A fifth potential provision would be how people would access the medicines in a medicinal market. Would it be a situation where, as like with South Africa, in terms of the right to privacy, as an adult, you're allowed to grow your own cannabis for personal use. In that way, you can cure yourself and you can cultivate in your own private space, however much you would want and according to your specific needs. But on the other hand, in terms of the many ailments that we have within the region, you could look at maybe having a more public authority-based model to address that issue. So another point I would like to raise is that the reason why I think this harmonization process and the model law would be a success is because there are various efforts taking place across the region which would support and also which are already consistent with a more liberal view to drug policy regulation. So for example, in 2015, the AU Common African Position on Drugs was issued, and this basically sets out the different policy options that AU member states are looking at as they have assessed that the whole war on drugs approach and the criminalization of drugs has been ineffective. So there are active efforts looking to decriminalize drugs and looking at other ways to help society to deal with the drug problems, but also looking at the beneficial parts of drugs such as cannabis. Then there's also the model law there's the model drug law for West Africa, which was also developed based on that same assessment that the governments of the West African countries had taken note that drug laws within Western Africa were not having the intended effect. And so they've developed this model law which would assist countries to develop their drug prohibition laws and policies, which would probably be in a more liberal stance and less focused on the criminalization of drug possession. We also have the AU model law for medicinal products, which also looks to harmonize the development of medicines and scheduling, which would also assist in terms of accessibility of medicines. So again, these are all efforts that would go towards assisting the model law approach within the cannabis industry. And maybe even on a larger scale, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, the African Free Continental Trade Area Agreement was signed I believe in 2018. And the agreement embodies the largest trade agreement in history since the World Trade Organization. Now, the Continental Free Trade Area would establish a continental market for goods and services and freedom of movement and of people and investments across the continent, which would boost intra-African trade and also enhance competitiveness in industries and at an enterprise level by exploiting opportunities for scale production and continental market access for better reallocation of resources. Essentially, I think my presentation has also tried to highlight that cannabis can also be used for development and that there's no reason why you cannot have a large-scale commercial stance as well as an inclusive approach, which also takes into account the people that have been doing this on the ground for many years. I would also advocate for African countries avoiding a race to the bottom, and that would be where we compete among each other to access investment and to attract investors to invest in our countries based on, say, for example, offering lower costs. And those are the kind of issues that would come up and that I believe harmonization would address. As it is, cannabis as a medicine is already highly accepted in Southern Africa, and its medical use would be widely taken up and it would spread quickly. And looking at a statistical angle in terms of population growth, this is also likely to be a very huge market for the industry, and I believe that cannot be ignored. Basically, in conclusion, I believe that the time is right, because at the moment, with all the reforms taking place, it is much easier to present a potential solution before you have a law in place, which would then need to be repealed. A model law would serve as a guide for the national legislator in enacting law or amending an existing one. It would provide countries with enough flexibility to contextualize the model law on medicinal cannabis for their specific context, but still remaining coordinated and harmonized with the rest of the region. And this initiative would be supported by the various harmonization efforts that I've highlighted previously. And I think it would be a practical effort, and it would also require follow-up activities to ensure that it is effective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tseli Khiba.